Alright, so we continue with chapter 13, and our big questions for this chapter are: what is a family? Why has family life become the topic of such heated debate? What challenges do we face as we develop relationships and balance family and work? What is it like to grow up in the 21st century family? What causes inequality among families? And then what social policies around the world best support changing families? This is a huge chapter, and I'm going to cover questions 1, 2, 3, and 6. 4 and 5, 4 is really just a lot of sort of talk and speculation, so I'm not going to specifically hit it in class. 5, we've covered some of that stuff already in the inequality chapter, and so it just specifically addresses those same topics as they apply to the family. So I'm not going to specifically cover it here. You can just look over them in your book later. So to begin with, what is a family? The idea is that families are a universal social institution. They exist in pretty much every culture around the world. But what does change and vary is the type of family, or how we define family. So from a historical perspective, we've seen arranged marriages, which is, instead of picking who you want to marry yourself, your family, your parents, or your grandparents, pretty much shortly after you get born, decide who you're going to marry. And then a few years later, they introduce you to this person and say, yes, this is going to be your spouse. Polygamy has probably been the most common form of marriage historically, and that is where one person, typically a man, has many spouses. Multi-generational households have been fairly common, where you have maybe grandparents, parents, and the children living all in one household. And we once again mentioned patrilocal cultures, which I mentioned briefly in the last chapter. And these are cultures in which the wife is required to live with her husband's parents and obey their authority. So there have been many, many different kinds of families and definitions of families over the years. We tend to think that traditional family that they were talking about in the video we watched the other day, that consists of mom, dad, 2.5 kids, all that sort of stuff, has been something that has been around forever. But this form of the family really came into prominence in the post-World War II era. We were talking a couple of weeks ago about the return to normalcy and the idea that the World War was such a horrible, awful thing. The prevailing policy of the time was everything is normal now. The war is over, and we're going to build a great life once again. And this idea of the family was part of that return to normalcy. What they called it in the video the other day was post-World War II propaganda. The June Cleavers, the Ozzie and Harriets, all those sort of television sitcoms that sold this idea of the family. Adding to the development of this is the development of the suburbs. People are moving out of the big cities for the first time, and we have that sort of huge population growth that led to what generation of people? What do we call that generation of people that were born post-World War II? The baby boomers, yes. So while the majority of American households did take this form, many did not. And what we can tell from a lot of research and studies at the time is that many husbands and wives that ended up living in these traditional households actually kind of found them unnecessarily stifling. When we're talking about the family and how we define family, we also need to make the distinction between a kinship system and a household. How we define who's going to be part of the family. Talking about a kinship system, this is defined as the social links and boundaries that are defined by biology and social custom that establish whom is related to whom. In modern settings, especially in the U.S., it's common to stress the emotional bonds, whether or not they're linked by concrete bonds of law or biology. And if you have really, really close friends, and you've known for a very, very long time, that you sometimes consider family. They might not actually be related by law, such as marriage, or by blood, but you're close enough that you consider them family. And so our definitions of what constitutes family sometimes are a little bit more relaxed than some cultures. If we are considering a household, such as the census does, then we only really look at the family unit that lives together. The idea here is that neither system is right or wrong or better than the other. So sociologists concluded the family as a social institution with multiple dimensions. Sometimes we look at kinship ties. Sometimes we look at the household, and it's sort of all-encompassing under that definition of family. Okay. We do distinguish between the families we inherit and the families we create, however. So we have this concept of the family of orientation. This consists of the people that are linked to us by birth. So when we are born, this is our family of orientation. Our immediate siblings, our parents, perhaps maybe our grandparents. Then we have the family of procreation, which consists of the relatives we gain over the course of our lives through marriage and childbearing. So it's your spouse and your children. But this definition, this family of procreation, is becoming somewhat dated, as procreation in and of itself can encompass the wide range of chosen families that are emerging. Because we do, at some point, see a lot of families that emerge through other means, adoption, and the like, instead of just procreation. So kinship can be a complicated question in a modern society. The question that we would be answering here is, where do the laws and the customs of the culture limit the family responsibility? And by family responsibility, we mean those ties and duties that we commonly assign to members of the family. Okay? If we view families as households, our attention turns to residence patterns. And the U.S. Census Bureau, like I mentioned before, focuses on household units. So it distinguishes between family households and non-family households on the definition of biological or legal ties. So a family household would be through marriage or parent-child. Non-family households would be examples of cohabitation, or maybe a group of friends living together as roommates. The drawback to this is it explicitly includes married couples and their children and single parents living with children, but it excludes childless couples who are not married but living together, whether they are straight or gay. So the idea is that this census data can sometimes be a little bit skewed, because we use the census data for everything. We use the census data for some economic projections. We use the census data to figure out relationship ties between people. And if you are like a long-term dating couple that has been living together but not married, that doesn't necessarily turn up in our census data. If you are a long-term dating couple that has children, that doesn't necessarily turn up in our census data correctly all the time. So it leaves some things out. Any overall questions about the differences between the household method or the kinship method, and why we might use one or the other? Okay. All right. So then, what constitutes membership in our own and others' families, and how should family members treat each other? It's one of the common questions that we have to answer when we start talking about families. And this is also the source of one of our most heated debates. From the legitimacy of gay marriage to parental rights for surrogate parents to abortion rights to employment among mothers, all of these things reflect a growing political and social divide between those who believe it is essential to maintain a relatively narrow definition of the family and those who believe it is necessary to be much broader and more flexible. And we saw many of these different viewpoints in what we were watching the other day. There are some people that believe that the family consists simply of mom, dad, and the children. There are some people believe that that family definition should be a little bit broader. And our thoughts on these matters also impact our thoughts on all other sorts of things. Who is appropriate to go out to work? Who should be the primary breadwinner? Who should be staying at home with the kids? And all these other issues mentioned above kind of get wrapped into that idea of the family debate.